Firstly, just so other Meriam people don't have any ammunition against me, when pronouncing my title, Meriam means I'm from Mer, obviously. Komet Lair is a Komet person, so that's one of the 8 tribes. Man, okay, so it doesn't really work, so it means Komet person man. So I'd just like to, for the Meriam people out there who might want to try and mock me after my conversation, I'll correct that. So firstly, I'd like to thank Uncle Perry Wandin for his wonderful welcome to country this morning and acknowledge his people, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, as the traditional owners of this country. I acknowledge their ongoing connection to this country and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge my First Nations brothers and sisters here today in the fight for justice and equality, and their allies here as well. So my discussion today will centre on economic empowerment for First Nations people here in Australia. I'll be focusing on the potential of the transition to the renewable energy sector to drive this empowerment. But firstly, I'd like to reflect on the rich history of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander societies pre-colonisation, their disempowerment through colonial laws and policies, and the journey toward restoring justice. Historically, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander societies were vibrant and diverse. They were encompassing trade and commerce, where evidence from archaeological findings has revealed extensive trade networks, such as exchange of baler shells, spears, ochres, wooden shields, canoes, and boomerangs across many regions of Australia. And there were complex governance structures as well, and long established cultural and traditional practices with strong spiritual connection to country. These features of our ancient societies were in place for tens of thousands of years and were confirmed by a number of land rights cases. The first one brought by the Yungle people, Meriam and Nabalco, where Justice Blackburn expressed at 266 to 267, the evidence shows a subtle and elaborate system highly adapted to the country in which the people led their lives, which provided a stable order of society and was remarkably free from the vagaries of personal whim or influence. If ever a system could be called a government of laws and not of men, it is that shown in the evidence before me. And then in the case Mabo from my people, the Meriam people in the Torres Straits, the late Sir Gerard Brennan, in his leading judgment at paragraph 28 expressed, according to the cases, the common law itself took from Indigenous inhabitants any right to occupy their traditional land, expose them to deprivation of religious, cultural and economic sustenance which the land provides, vested the land effectively in the control of the imperial authorities without any right to compensation, and made the Indigenous inhabitants intruders in their own homes and mendicants for a place to live. And in West Australia and Ward, and I note this is a Justice North decision who's here today, so he discussed and suggested that a continuing system of trade and artefacts had existed between Aboriginal inhabitants and the claim area and Aboriginal groups from more distant places. So that was recognised as evidence in that case. And there was evidence of that trade occurring for over 40,000 years. However, as many of you here today know, colonial laws and policies have systematically dismantled these societal structures, resulting in widespread disempowerment, such as stolen land, with the doctrine of terra nullius denied Indigenous lands, allowing British settlers to claim land without treaties. Policies like Crown Land Acts also excluded Indigenous people from accessing traditional lands, and Aboriginal Protection Acts forcibly relocated Indigenous people to reserves. There were stolen wages. Under Protection Acts, wages earned by Indigenous workers were withheld in the government-controlled accounts and paid in rations, and my family was a party to that as well in Queensland. My grandparents worked up in the Torres Strait on boats, and my parents incidentally came down to the mainland around North Queensland where they had their wages stolen as well. There was minimal compensation for that. I think we got a couple of grand for that, but I think that's doesn't really compensate a family in case it probably would have had enough money to buy property and that sort of stuff back then as well, which we all know what property is worth these days, so would have got us more in front. But events like the Wave Hill walk-off in 1966 highlighted the systemic wage theft then, and then, as we know, I think Josh Creamer, who is going to be talking tomorrow, has incidentally brought a number of, or assisted in a number of stolen wages cases for our people up there in North Queensland. I think we got about $180 million for that, but I believe obviously there's a lot of us, so like I said, a couple of $1,000s each wasn't really enough. And then there's stolen children. So the Protection Acts, once again, allowed children to be stolen. There are assimilation policies which removes children from their families to integrate them into non-Indigenous society, eroding cultural identity and leading to trauma-filled stolen generations where children were placed in institutions and non-Indigenous homes. And I'll speak about stolen language as well. Stolen language, stolen culture, stolen traditions. Again, acts like the Protection Acts, when removing people, also allowed them or disallowed them to practice their own language groups or language from their groups, forcing them into missions and reserves. And there are policies such as assimilation. The policies of assimilation also suppressed ceremonies and customs as well. So the efforts to erase cultural identity left lasting scars, and the scars obviously continue today. Stolen lives. So there are killings and massacres all around Australia, as we know, where violence against Indigenous communities was sanctioned through laws and informed practices such as martial law declarations, native police forces, which resulted in killings and massacres. Policies justified settler violence under the guise of clearing land for development. So the legacy of this disempowerment continues to affect First Nations communities today, evidenced by gaps in health outcomes, life expectancy, economic opportunities. While progress has been made, questions still remain. The native title and land rights regime equate to full restoration of stolen land? I would think not. Can compensation for stolen wages or apologies for stolen generations restore an economic base or repair broken families? Likely not. Will the removal of lost languages and traditions ever be restored? Some of these languages are lost forever and irreversible. However, during my talk, I will advocate that part of the solution lies in fostering economic empowerment through innovative methods and participation in commercial and economic activities through a just renewable transition. This sector offers opportunities for community-led enterprises where First Nations people can lead and benefit from renewable energy projects, ensuring local employment and revenue generation, sustainable development, where renewable energy aligns with the cultural values of our environmental stewardship, ownership and governance, where First Nations participation in renewable energy initiatives ensures decisions respect traditional knowledge and land rights. Despite systemic injustices, First Nations people are resilient. Economic empowerment through renewable energy can offer a pathway to reclaim agency, restore economic independence, and build sustainable futures while honouring the legacy of our First Nations society. The challenge remains to address the historical inequalities, and ensure that laws and policies genuinely seek to restore what was taken, setting a foundation of lasting empowerment and reconciliation. I will now focus on some thinking about how First Nations people can leverage the current climate, pardon the pun, and the benefit from commercial and economic activities on their respective traditional lands and waters, particularly those activities relating to a just transition to renewable energy. When the Albanese government was elected in 2022, one of the first things that the Albanese government committed to was the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We all know how parts of that went. However, in his victory speech, he went on further to state that together we can end the climate wars. Together we can take advantage of the opportunity for Australia to be a renewable energy superpower. The Australian government has since committed to a net zero plan, guiding our transition to a legislative target of net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050, the government states that the plan will also be consistent with its international and domestic commitments. To assist in achieving these goals under the Renewable Energy Electricity Act 2000, the Clean Energy Regulator announced that the National Renewable Energy Target has set an ambitious goal at least 33,000 gigawatts of additional renewable electricity generation annually from 2020 to 2030. There is also a commitment from the federal government for generation of 82% of electricity from renewable sources by 2030. A large part of the commitment to net zero is transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which will include strategies at a micro level, such as rooftop solar and community microgrids, and developing large-scale renewable energy projects. The interplay here is that much of the strategy will need to involve First Nations people in some form or another. Why do I say this? Well, the Australian Government, the Productivity Commission, has stated that as of 30th of June 2023, about 4.2 million square kilometres of landmass was subject to land rights for First Nations people. By my calculations, this equates to 54.8% of Australia. According to the National Native Title Tribunal, there are currently 132 claim applications for native title. So by the time Australia reaches its milestone for the reduction of greenhouse emissions in 2050, one can project that a large percentage of First Nations land interests will be significantly greater and impact that. So it is likely that the state and federal governments, as well as proponents, will be required to engage with traditional owners with respect to the renewable energy projects. It is also critical that when dealing with First Nations communities, the principles of free, prior and informed consent are upheld at all levels of renewable energy project life cycles. So the challenge is balancing the competing requirements of the respective stakeholders in relation to such projects. So how can First Nations people be empowered and meaningfully participate in renewable energy transition? Let's firstly look at the international instruments that have long set sensible, robust frameworks for member states to incorporate into their government systems. Tony mentioned earlier UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It provides a valuable framework for Australia when considering developing projects on country. I'll talk to the matters that are specifically related, or the parts that are specifically related to the environment and could relate to projects on country. There are a number of articles. I'll mention Article 29, paragraph 1, which provides Indigenous people have the right to conservation and protection of the environment and productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources, and that states shall enable this without discrimination. Tony spoke about discrimination, Native Title Act, so that's still to come, I imagine. Article 32, paragraphs 1, 2 and 3 provide that Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories or other resources. It also states that states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples to obtain their free, prior and informed consent for the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and resources. And finally, that states shall provide effective mechanisms for just and fair redress for those aforementioned activities. This much-cited convention provides a significant backdrop for the involvement of traditional owners in activities on their country. Another relevant international instrument is the Paris Agreement on climate change. Australia is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, and that was signed by 170 countries in April in 2016. One of the main aims of the Paris Agreement is to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees. The Paris Agreement provides a number of references to the involvement of Indigenous peoples as well in addressing climate change. The first reference is set in the preamble of the agreement, where it expresses that in consideration of climate change, the parties should respect, promote and consider the rights of Indigenous peoples and the right to development. Further, Article 7, paragraph 2 of the agreement further expresses that parties acknowledge the Parties acknowledge that the adaptation action should follow a participatory and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems, with a view to integrating adaptation into relevant socio-economic and environmental policies and actions where appropriate. Article 2 of the Paris Agreement expresses that the agreement aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. Following this, in 2021, there was a Glasgow Climate Pact, which distilled outcomes from COP26, and that emphasised the collaborative role that Indigenous people play, and highlighted the buy-in required by urging parties to actively involve Indigenous people in the development and implementation of climate action. The challenge, therefore, is how nation-states and Indigenous people can coexist in a framework that establishes economic and environmental objectives while sustainably developing country. Speaking of sustainable development, I'd like to briefly touch on what this concept entails. In 1987, the Brundtland Report conceptualised sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. At the centre of the Brundtland Report was the linkage of economic and ecological policies into an integrated framework. The concept of sustainable development was then enshrined in 1992 in the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Under the Rio Declaration, particular emphasis was made on the vital role of Indigenous people and their communities in the conservation and sustainable management of the environment, given their knowledge and traditional practices. It recommended that the states recognise and duly support for their identity, culture and interests, and enable their effective participation in the achievement of sustainable development. This was reaffirmed again in the 2002 Johannesburg Declaration. So it can be said that concepts of caring for country are likely to be in tune with the notions of sustainable development. So what are the mechanisms to assist First Nations people in participating in renewable energy projects, if they so wish? On the weekend, I did some light reading. I read the bill for the Future Made in Australia Act while others were out having fun. I lie, I went to the Victorian Aboriginal Business Awards. But anyway, I spent some time reading the Future Made in Australia Act, the bill. It was passed on Friday, the 29th of November, so quite recently. And there are some positives that have come out of that act, or that bill. For those who are not familiar with its aims, the Future Made in Australia agenda announced in the 2024-2025 budget is a $22.7 billion investment over a decade aimed at positioning Australia as a key player in the global economy during the transition to net zero emissions. The plan seeks to build a more resilient, diversified economy powered by renewable energy, creating secure, well-paid jobs and encouraging private sector investment. Essentially, the agenda wishes to position Australia as the renewable energy superpower, as I spoke about earlier, with Mr. Albanese announcing this. I'll only focus on aspects of how First Nations people can leverage impending legislation to benefit their respective communities. So in section 10.3a of the bill, which relates to community benefit principles, it expresses how benefits can flow to communities through funding support, where decision makers in making funding decisions need to take into consideration how proponents will engage collaboratively with and achieving positive outcomes for local communities, such as First Nations communities and communities directly affected by the transition to net zero. And there's also a section in there about supporting First Nations community and traditional owners to participate in and share in the benefits of the transition to net zero. In relation to engaging collaboratively, the explanatory memorandum, or EM, states that this principle prioritises early and collaborative engagement with affected communities, including First Nations communities and communities directly affected by the transition to zero, to achieve positive outcomes aligned with community expectations. Where an applicant proposes activities in a certain location, the decision maker may consider how the applicant intends to ensure that the local community views are heard and taken into account when deciding how the activity is undertaken. Considerations might include how the proponent has undertaken early engagement, what research has taken place to inform future engagement, or how the proponent wishes to ensure an inclusive engagement process, including with frequently underrepresented groups such as First Nations peoples. Now, this approach does not give us the position of free, prior and informed consent, but it does push proponents to incorporate the involvement of First Nations communities as a requirement of potential projects on country. In relation to supporting communities, the EM states that this principle builds on the previous principle and is intended that the principle would direct decision makers and proponents to achieving outcomes for First Nations communities and traditional owners, and acknowledge the critical role of First Nations communities and traditional owners to participate in and share in the benefits of the energy transition to net zero. So it appears that some aspects of the international instruments that I spoke about have trickled down into this Act, where the government has applied the requirement for some form of negotiation between proponents seeking funding and the representative traditional owners in the spirit of self-determination. My concern is whether the relevant traditional owner group is resourced or has capacity to negotiate with proponents in the development of projects. This has been an ongoing problem in my experience, and I think it was mentioned there by Tony as well as an ongoing issue as well with native title matters and many other areas as well. So that said, the EM also discusses providing a priority support for First Nations community to engage with project proponents. Incidentally, the Treasurer, Dr. Jim Chalmers, announced as part of the Future Made in Australia Production Tax Credit and Other Measures Bill, said that further changes will be made which will increase IBA's ability to borrow and raise capital, and the government's word, in the government's words, will supercharge IBA's ability to inject finance into activities that can promote greater economic empowerment, self-determination, and better life outcomes for First Nations people. So the government also states that the changes will support more First Nations people to start, grow and sustain businesses, purchase homes, and invest in commercial ventures. So I'm fascinated to actually see how this plays out in the practical sense. So it may be a case of we watch this and see what happens. So in considering mechanisms that traditional owners can utilise to become involved in renewable energy projects, I'll start with the obvious. Though if applicable to the respective First Nations group, the Native Title Act and Indigenous land use agreements, as spoken about previously, and also land rights acts can be useful frameworks as well, where Indigenous communities, through their representative bodies, such as prescribed body corporates, can negotiate agreements to cover land access, economic benefits, revenue sharing, and employment opportunities, as well as co-ownership models. However, as I discussed previously, these organisations may require resourcing, but also assistance in structuring as well. Some organisations, in my experience, aren't structured correctly. They might need assistance with governance models, resourcing and capacity building. So I think they're important aspects as well, but the Future Made in Australia Act talks a little bit about that as well. Now, traditional owners can also leverage the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Acts as well in the regulations, where companies are required to assess and manage the impacts of projects and Indigenous cultural heritage. These communities can use acts to ensure renewable energy projects respect cultural heritage and to negotiate culturally appropriate terms, including involvement in heritage protection roles, co-management of projects, and compensation for disruptions to cultural sites. Many larger companies are also adopting corporate social responsibility and industry standard practices as well. These may include consultation and benefit sharing with First Nations communities, and companies may also follow industry standards and guidelines from bodies like Clean Energy Council, which encourage ethical engagement and support for Indigenous-led renewable energy projects. Incidentally, the Clean Energy Council has developed a publication called the Leading Practice Principles, First Nation and Renewable Energy Projects, which some of you may consider a useful tool. So First Nations communities can leverage these CSR expectations to negotiate for training also, employment opportunities, community investment and environmental stewardships. There are also state and federal renewable energy policies and initiatives as well. These can support Indigenous participation in renewable energy, for example, Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, where funds for projects can support Indigenous land management, renewable energy initiatives, and sustainable economic development. Organisations like ARENA can provide grants and funding for renewable energy projects to assist in greater First Nations participation. These projects can prioritise partnerships to foster Indigenous economic development and can be leveraged by communities to co-invest or to seek funding for Indigenous-owned projects. One of my hats is that I'm an advisor and I'm on the assessment panel for ARENA for project funding. And a pertinent part of the application process is that proponents who wish to develop renewable energy projects on country are required to observe free, prior and informed consent and demonstrate how they can apply this from design phase through the life cycle of the project to decommissioning and revitalising the affected area. They also need to demonstrate how local community can share benefits from the projects. And I should also mention that ARENA, under the Future Made in Australia regime, have just been allocated $6 billion as well for the renewable energy projects around country as well. And part of this is earmarked for projects for affected Indigenous communities. So there's some positives coming out of that as well. Another positive example is in the state of Victoria. Us at Jaramer Legal have been advising the Victorian Government on a regime that establishes a traditional owner trust that pays a fee for access for traditional owner communities for transmission lines that run through their communities. So this will be an annual payment which will be held in a trust and dispersed according to the trust requirements. And organisations may also consider joint venture models as well. Now, I've come across a lot of joint venture models where Indigenous-owned businesses and organisations are partnering with renewable energy companies to establish co-owned projects. I've seen many of these JVs and partnerships and potential JVs and partnerships come through the ARENA assessment application system as well. And I can say that if they are done right, they can be quite beneficial and beneficial to the respective First Nation communities and businesses. I'll give you one example of a rather large project in the Kimberleys, the East Kimberley Clean Energy Project, which is created and managed by a partnership called the Aboriginal Clean Energy Partnership. It's a new company with equal shares held by traditional owners over the relevant land. The MG Corporation, which represents the Meriam and Gadjaran people, and the Balangara people, the Balangara Aboriginal Corporation. They own 25% each of that partnership. The Kimberley Land Council also own 25% of that partnership, and the global investment and advisory company Pollination also owns 25%. So the first stage of the project will involve building a 900 megawatt solar farm, more than double the size of the country's biggest so far built, and a 50,000 tonne per year green hydrogen plant on the MG Corporation freehold land in Kununurra. The resulting solar energy will be combined with fresh water from Lake Kununurra and hydro energy from the existing Ord River at Lake Argyle to produce green energy that will be transported through a new 120 kilometre pipeline to the export-ready port of Wyndham. There it will be converted into green ammonia. About 250,000 tonnes of green ammonia is expected to be produced annually for both domestic and export markets in the fertiliser and explosive sectors. Construction for the project is expected to start in the mid-2025, with the hydrogen production starting in late 2028. So as you can see, there is this is rather a large, ambitious project, but one that's a good example through the partnership model. So this will provide a great opportunity for the Aboriginal community and also the business sector in general in the Kimberley region. So another aspect is the Indigenous procurement policies with organisations and communities can also leverage. These policies mandate that government agencies and their contractors must procure goods and services from Indigenous-owned businesses. These policies are excellent frameworks for First Nations communities, entrepreneurs and businesses to access government contracts generally. State and federal governments are able to flow down obligations to their contractors to procure goods and services from Indigenous businesses through government tenders and contractual documents. The final mechanism I wish to speak about is the international trade agreements. These have been very limited in expressing provisions for First Nations people until recently. Quite an interesting development, and one that I admit I haven't tested yet, is the Australia-United Arab Emirates Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA, that was signed on the 6th of November 2024, so it's just recent. In my opinion, the CEPA sets a significant achievement in Australia's trade policy by incorporating a dedicated chapter on First Nations trade and cooperation. So this is the first time that a trade agreement has included the First Nations chapter. The Australian Financial Review has reported that the UAE has around $2.5 trillion in its sovereign wealth fund, so has plenty of bakir or bungu, otherwise known as money, to invest. Key provisions related to the First Nations chapter include where CEPA promotes First Nations trade and investment by establishing a framework aimed at enhancing trade and investment opportunities for First Nation businesses. This initiative is designed to facilitate the participation of Indigenous enterprises in the UAE market, thereby fostering economic empowerment and cultural exchange. The agreement also reserves Australia's right to implement policy measures and provide more favourable treatment to Australian First Nations people. The provision allows for the development of domestic policies that support the unique economic and cultural needs of First Nations communities. It's early days for the CEPA, but I'm fascinated to see how its potential will play out. In summary, there are a multitude of opportunities for our First Nations communities and business to consider if they wish to. By leveraging these mechanisms, the First Nations communities and businesses can secure appropriate commercial arrangements, negotiate equitable revenue streams, ensure environmental and cultural protections are in place, and they can achieve meaningful economic participation during a renewable energy transition. These tools not only empower First Nations people to engage in sustainable energy projects on their terms, but also ensure that they benefit from Australia's shift towards a renewable energy future. And that's it from me. So thank you very much for that, allowing me to come and chat about that. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you very much. There is a lot going on, but we're going to wait here and see if there are any questions. Does anyone have a question for Brian out there? Beautiful at the back there. We've got a microphone coming to you. We'll wait a minute. Thank you.
Hello, Brian. My name's Jackie. I've worked a bit in the Torres Strait, and I call it judicial tourism, and nothing prepares you for the beauty of the dual seas of the Torres Strait, and I've been to Meriam. But looking at clean energy, Thursday Island, as you know, is a major centre, hospital, gubby organisations, schools, hotels, Main Street, department store. It's quite a centre, quite a town. But what I noticed when I worked up there, I saw one sort of broken down old wind turbine, but was shocked to find that the power for TI was diesel. It was a diesel power station. Is that still the case, do you know? And is there a clean energy transition for the people in the Torres?
Yeah, I haven't lived up there at all, actually. I was born up in Innisfail, so in North Queensland, but my family came directly from there.
Well, I went to school in Gundi, so we were neighbours.
Up the road. But yeah, obviously I know, I've been up there many times and I know how my people live. So there is Mussig Island. I don't know if you know Mussig Island. There's going to be a project up there. There's a few members of that Torres Strait 8 that fought the international case to the ICJ about climate change and the islands going under. So they've got a project up there with some solar on that island, and I don't know. I'm working on some other projects as well in my entrepreneurial sort of pursuits as well, where I think these islands have limited space, so they're quite small. So I would sort of advocate for something outside of the island where there's some floating windmills or something, wind turbines, sort of off country, so you still allow, the land to for activities, etc. But there's plenty of seas, as you know, up there, and there's also plenty of tidal currents as well that go through. Because as you imagine, Torres Strait in New Guinea is quite a small passage, and when the tides sort of go back and forth, they just go through a small passage, and it's quite rapid. So I think there's great potential there for projects to be up there. But I've got a number of hats. I sit on a board for Original Power as well, and they're an organisation that put the first a microgrid in an Aboriginal community just in Northern Territory. So there's a small township with 80 people. So they now have renewable energy going constantly with batteries and solar. And that's really good because obviously electricity bills are quite high, and in those remote communities as well, they have these cards as well, and you've got to purchase cards in order to put in the slot, and you get electricity through to your house. But so if you don't have any money to buy or purchase a card, you don't have electricity. So that's a sad thing. So these communities, hopefully, and through these arena funding things, so I'm also involved. I'm supposed to be doing an assessment tomorrow actually for a microgrid in another community. And part of that, like I said, part of that assessment is that to ensure that communities actually benefit from that. So ARENA has that criteria to say that if you want funding for your projects, you need to ensure that communities benefit. So there's some positives coming out of that, and obviously there's more money coming into the system now through the Future Made in Australia Act and allocation to ARENA, as I discussed. So I think the future's looking positive in that regard, and I look forward to trying to work out structures and things with communities, because we're working with a number of communities at the moment around Victoria as to how to structure their organisation, and some aren't set up. Some aren't set up as well, resourced and have capacity to negotiate, I guess, and be involved or participate meaningfully in the renewable energy transition. So the Victorian government, we're assisting them with some work as well, and they're providing $116,000 for each community to get ready for the renewable energy transition. But that's not enough, and community are saying, that's not enough. So I think there's much to be done, but I think the Commonwealth Government is recognising that now.